There are places in history that do not fall with the sound of swords, but with silence. A silence so complete, it feels unnatural, as if the world itself has chosen to stop breathing. This was one of those places. The great city of Hattusa, once the beating heart of an empire, now stood still, not abandoned by time, but abandoned by life. The streets, once crowded with merchants shouting prices, children chasing each other through narrow alleys, and the rhythmic footsteps of soldiers, had grown empty. Not slowly, not over generations, but all at once. Doors remained open, as if their owners meant to return. Clay pots lay shattered where they had fallen, grain spilled across the ground untouched. Even the animals had gone quiet. No barking dogs, no rescated. Only the wind, moving through a city that no longer resisted it. If you had walked these streets, you might have felt it immediately that something was wrong. Not the aftermath of war, not the scars of conquest, but something far more unsettling. Because war leaves behind destruction. This left behind absence, and absence is harder to understand. There were no enemies at the gates, no armies marching in, no flames consuming the skyline. And yet, the city was dying. The people of this land, part of the powerful Hittite Empire, had faced enemies before. They had fought wars, signed treaties, built alliances. They had stood against kings and survived. But now they faced something they could not see, could not fight, could not even understand. At first, they whispered about it. A strange sickness, a fever that would not break, a cough that lingered, a weakness that spread from one body to another. But whispers soon turned into fear, because what begins as a story becomes something else when it reaches your home. And one by one it did. The city did not fall in a single moment. It faded like a flame running out of air. And somewhere within this silence, a story was unfolding. Not of kings, not of warriors, but of a boy who would make a choice when everyone else chose to run. His name was Kaka, a name that history would never record, and yet a life that would carry more weight than many kings. He was 12 years old, but looked like a man of 18 years. An age where most children still chase shadows, still laugh without reason, still believe the world is something simple. But Kaka had learned otherwise. Life in Hattusa was not gentle, even before the sickness came. Water had to be carried, food had to be earned, and survival was never guaranteed. And yet, there was something unusual about this boy, something that set him apart, even in a city filled with struggle. Every morning, before the sun fully claimed the sky, Kaka would walk the same path, barefoot across cold stone, carrying a clay jar that the water inside would shift with each step, forcing him to slow down, to steady himself, to be careful. But he never complained, because the water was not for him. At the end of that path was a house that no one else visited anymore. Inside, an old woman lay alone. No family, no one to care for her. In a world that had begun to turn its back on the weak, she had already been forgotten, except by him. Kaka would kneel beside her, carefully placing the jar down as if it were something sacred. His hand, small, rough, untrained, would lift her gently, helping her drink, helping her breathe, helping her exist just a little longer. He did not do it for reward. No one praised him. No one even noticed. But he came every single day, because somewhere in his young mind, he understood something most adults had already forgotten, that survival is not the same as humanity. Outside, the city was changing. People were beginning to close their doors. Voices were growing quieter, and fear was starting to spread faster than reason. But inside that small, dim room, there was still something alive. Not hope, not yet, but something close to it. Compassion. And sometimes, in the darkest moments of history, that is the only thing that remains. Kaka.
10 measures of grain for this vase.
That is too much. I will give you 8.
Deal.
It is easy to look at ruins and forget what they once were. to see broken walls and imagine they were always silent. But Hattusa was not built for silence. It was built for life. Before the sickness, before the fear. This city was a center of power, of trade, of movement. Caravans arrived from distant lands, bringing copper, tin, textiles, stories from worlds far beyond the horizon. The people of the Hittite Empire were not isolated. They were connected to kingdoms, to cultures, to conflict. Their roads stretched across regions. Their influence touched empires. And at the heart of it all was this city. Markets filled the air with noise. Merchants called out prices. Buyers argued. Animals moved restlessly through crowded streets. Children laughed, running between stalls, unaware of the fragile balance that held their world together. Even Kaka had seen it. He had walked through these same streets, not in silence, but surrounded by life. And yet, that same connection, that same openness, would become their greatest vulnerability. Because what connects people also carries danger. Trade routes do not just move goods. They move disease. Armies do not just bring victory. They bring consequences. Years before the plague tightened its grip on Hattusa, the Hittites had fought one of the greatest battles of their time, the Battle of Kadesh, a clash of empires, a moment that would be remembered in inscriptions, celebrated as strength, as dominance, as power. But history often hides its true cost, because when soldiers returned from war, they did not come back alone. They carried something with them, something invisible, something silent. At first, no one noticed, because danger that cannot be seen is easy to ignore. A cough was just a cough, a fever just a passing illness. But slowly, the pattern began to emerge. People were not recovering. Families were not healing. And the life that once filled these streets began to fade. What had once been a symbol of strength. Victory has a way of blinding those who survive it. It convinces men that the worst has already passed, that whatever lies ahead must surely be easier than war. And so, when the soldiers returned to Hattusa, they were welcomed not with suspicion, but with relief. They had marched across distant lands, fought beneath foreign skies, and lived. For the people of the Hittite Empire, that was enough. Stories spread quickly, of chariots clashing, of strategies unfolding, of the great confrontation remembered as the Battle of Kadesh. A battle so immense that both sides would later claim victory. But no one spoke of what truly returned with the soldiers. At first it was subtle, a man coughing as he entered the gate, another leaning too heavily on his spear, a third unable to stand without help. They were tired, people said.
Woken.
Just rest, my love. We are here with you.
Death rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with thunder. It begins with something small, something easy to dismiss. A fever that lingers a little too long. A cough that refuses to fade. A weakness that settles deep into the bones. At first, the people of Hattusa did what people have always done. They waited. They hoped. They believed it would pass. Because illness was not new. People fell sick and recovered. That was the rhythm of life. But this was different. Those who fell ill did not recover. The fever did not break. The coughing did not stop. And the strength did not return. Instead, it spread from one person to another, from one house to the next. Families began to notice patterns. But patterns are useless when there is no explanation. Mothers watched their children weaken. Children watched their parents collapse. And no one understood why. The healers tried what they could. Herbs, rituals, prayers. But nothing changed. Nothing slowed it. Nothing stopped it. And then came the moment that transforms fear into certainty. The first death is always the hardest to accept. But the second, and the third, and the fourth leave no room for denial. Soon death was no longer an exception. It was becoming the expectation. The old woman Kaka cared for grew quieter with each passing day. Her hands trembled, her breath shallow. He brought water, as he always did, lifting her gently, encouraging her to drink. But even he could feel it, that something was changing, something beyond his understanding. He did not have words for it. He did not know what a plague was. But he knew that people were disappearing and not coming back. Outside, the streets began to empty. Doors closed and stayed closed. Neighbors stopped visiting each other because somewhere deep beneath the confusion, a realization was forming that being close to others might be the very thing that brings death closer. And so, without fully understanding why, the people of Hattusa began to do something unnatural. They began to avoid one another because fear had begun to replace trust. And once that happens, a society does not just weaken, it begins to break. Power is often mistaken for protection. Kings build walls, command armies, shape the fate of nations. But there are forces in this world that do not recognize power. Forces that do not bow, do not negotiate, do not fear. The plague was one of them. It did not choose its victims based on status. It did not spare those who ruled. And so, the unthinkable began to happen. The king himself, Suppiluliuma, fell ill. A man who had led campaigns, expanded an empire, now lay powerless, his strength fading not on a battlefield, but in his own chamber. Around him, priests performed rituals, calling upon the gods, seeking answers, seeking mercy. But the silence remained. And then, he was gone. The loss of a king is never just personal. It is political, symbolic, destabilizing. But before the empire could even recover, the sickness struck again. His son, Untold, took the throne, only to follow the same path, falling ill, fading quickly, dying before his rule could truly begin. It was no longer just a crisis. It was a collapse, unfolding in real time. The throne passed once more, this time to a younger ruler, Mursili, and unlike those before him, he did not inherit strength. He inherited fear, because by now, the pattern was undeniable. If kings could fall, then no one was safe. The divine protection they believed in, the idea that rulers were favored by the gods, began to fracture. And when belief begins to break, it leaves behind something dangerous. Doubt. The people did not just fear the disease. They began to fear what it meant. Had the gods abandoned them? Had they done something to deserve this? Was this punishment or something worse? In the halls of power and in the smallest homes, the same question echoed. Why? And no one had an answer.
Is not good. There is no hope. We are doomed.
When power fails, when knowledge fails, when every human solution collapses, there's only one place left to turn, the divine. For Mursili, this was not a choice. It was desperation. Inside the dim chambers of Hattusa, scribes sat before wet clay tablets, their tools pressing into the surface, recording words that were never meant to be forgotten. Not orders, not victories, but pleas, real human pleas, from a king who had run out of answers. He spoke of loss, of his father gone, of his brother gone, of a land that was slowly emptying. And he asked the only question that remained. What have we done? To him, this was not just disease. It was meaning. It had to be, because without meaning, the suffering would be unbearable. He believed, as many did, that the gods were sending a message, that somewhere in the past, a mistake had been made, a ritual ignored, a promise broken, and now the punishment had come. These prayers, preserved in clay, are among the most human records we have from this time, not because they explain the plague, but because they reveal something deeper: fear without understanding, grief without closure, and a desperate need to make sense of something that refuses to be explained. The king did not know, but the answer he sought was not in the heavens, but in the world around him, in water, in animals, in the invisible movement of disease. But how could he? There were no microscopes, no science, no knowledge of bacteria. only belief. And belief was all he had. So he wrote, he prayed, he waited, but the plague did not answer. For the people of Hattusa, the plague was a mystery, a punishment, a curse, something sent by forces beyond their understanding. But today we see it differently, not as divine wrath, but as biology, as something small, so small it could not be seen, yet powerful enough to bring down an empire. What they were likely facing was a bacterial disease. Some scholars suggest tularemia, an infection that spreads through contaminated water, through animals, through contact. Others point to plague-like pathogens, carried by movement, by war, by disruption. And in truth, the exact identity may never be known, but the mechanism is clear. War had changed everything. Soldiers moved across regions, bringing with them more than weapons. Animals were transported. Food supplies were shared. Water sources became compromised. In a world without sanitation, without understanding of infection, these conditions were perfect. The disease did not need to be fast. It did not need to be dramatic. It only needed to move, quietly, consistently, from one body to another. And that is exactly what it did. A single infected person could unknowingly spread it to family, to neighbors, to an entire street. And because no one knew how it spread, they could not stop it. They could not isolate it. They could not fight it. Imagine living in that world, where death comes, but no one knows why, where helping someone might be the very thing that seals your own fate, where water, the source of life, could also be the source of death. This is what made the plague so terrifying, not just its power, but its invisibility, because an enemy you can see can be faced, but an enemy you cannot see becomes something else entirely. It becomes fear itself, and fear spreads faster than any disease. At first people stayed. They hoped. They waited. They believed it would pass. But there comes a moment when hope begins to feel like denial. And in that moment, people start to run. It did not happen all at once. There was no single signal, no unknown cement, no command, just a quiet realization, spreading from one mind to another, that staying might mean dying. Families began to pack what little they could carry. Food, tools, small pieces of their lives. Not everything, only what mattered most. Because when you are forced to leave, you learn quickly that most things do not matter at all. The roads leading out of Hattusa, once used for trade and travel, became paths of escape. Mothers held their children tightly. Fathers walked with urgency, eyes fixed ahead, not daring to look back, because looking back meant accepting what they were leaving behind. Homes, neighbors, memories, and sometimes people. Not everyone could leave. The elderly, the sick, those already too weak to walk. They were left behind, not because they were unloved, but because survival demanded impossible choices. This is what fear does. It forces humanity into conflict with itself. To save one life, another must be abandoned. And in that moment, something inside a society breaks. Kaka watched it happen. From the edge of the road, he saw people leaving, faster each day. The noise of movement, the urgency, the desperation. And for the first time, he faced a choice. Not as a child, but as someone standing between two futures. One where he leaves and lives. Another where he stays and faces the same unknown fate as those left behind. Most people would not hesitate because survival is instinct. It is natural. It is human. But sometimes there are choices that go beyond instinct. Choices that define not whether we live, but who we are. And Kaka was about to make one. He stood there, watching them leave, one by one, families disappearing into the distance, becoming smaller until they were nothing more than shapes on the horizon. The road ahead promised survival, or at least a chance at it. And for a moment, just a moment, he imagined himself among them, walking forward, leaving the city behind, leaving the sickness behind, leaving the fear behind. It would have been easy. No one would have stopped him. No one would have judged him, because everyone was doing the same. But then, Another thought entered his mind. Not loud, not overwhelming, but persistent. The old woman, the empty homes, the people who could not leave. And suddenly, the road ahead did not feel like escape. It felt like abandonment. Kaka looked down at his hands. Small, uncertain, not the hands of a warrior, not the hands of a leader, just a boy. And yet, those hands had carried water, had helped someone survive, had made a difference, even if no one else saw it, even if no one else cared. And in that moment, he understood something profound. That survival is not always the greatest victory. That sometimes, staying means more than escaping. He turned, slowly, deliberately, away from the road, and back toward the city, toward the silence, toward the sickness, toward the unknown. It was not a heroic moment. There were no witnesses, no applause, no recognition, just a quiet decision, made by a boy who chose others over himself. The city was no longer the same. What remained was not life, but fragments of it, broken routines, empty spaces, echoes of what once was. And within that emptiness, Kaka continued. Day after day, he walked the same paths, carrying water, carrying food, carrying something far more difficult. Responsibility. There were fewer people now, fewer voices, fewer signs of life. But those who remained needed help more than ever. The sick could not move. The weak could not stand. And many had no one left. Kaka became what the city no longer had. A presence, a connection, a reminder that they were not completely alone. He sat beside them, even when there was nothing he could do. He spoke, even when there was no answer. He stayed, even when leaving would have been easier. But compassion is not without consequence. Every moment he spent near the sick, every hand he held, every drop of water he shared, brought him closer to the same fate. He did not know it, or perhaps he chose not to think about it, because some actions are not driven by logic. They're driven by something deeper, something that refuses to calculate risk, that refuses to prioritize self-preservation, something that simply says, this is what must be done. And so he continued, even as the city grew quieter, even as the deaths increased, even as hope became harder to find. Because for those who remained, Kaka was no longer just a boy. He was the difference between being abandoned and being remembered, between dying alone and dying with someone beside you. And sometimes, that is the greatest gift anyone can give. There are moments in life that feel inevitable, not because we expect them, but because something deep inside us knows they cannot be avoided. For Kaka, that moment came quietly, not with pain, not with panic, but with a subtle change, a heaviness, a weakness that did not fade. At first, he ignored it, because there was still work to do, still people to help, still water to carry. But Kaka didn't know he had already been affected by the dangerous germs of plague, and no amount of will can override them forever. His steps slowed, his breathing grew shallow, the jar felt heavier with each passing day, and yet he continued until he couldn't. It happened in a place he knew well, the same doorway where he had once knelt, where he had once offered water, where he had once helped someone else survive. Now, he stood there, trying to hold on, trying to remain steady. But the strength was gone. The jar slipped from his hands. Time slowed. The sound of clay shattering echoed louder than it should have. Water spilled across the ground, spreading into the dust, disappearing almost instantly. Just like everything else, he fell, not dramatically, not violently, just quietly, as if the world had gently decided that it was his turn. And in that moment, the boy who had carried so much could carry no more. In the end, there was no one left to tell his story. No witnesses, no records, no names carved into stone. Just silence. The city of Hattusa, once powerful, once alive, had become something else entirely. A place where the wind moved freely, because there was nothing left to resist it. Kaka lay where he had fallen, not as a hero, not as a legend, but as something far more real, a human being who made a choice. History would remember kings. It would remember battles, treaties, empires rising and falling. It would remember the late Bronze Age collapse and the forces that reshaped the ancient world. But it would not remember him, because history does not always preserve the stories that matter most. And yet, his story exists, not in stone, but in what it represents, in a quiet truth that even in the darkest moments, when fear takes over, when survival becomes the only goal, there are still those who choose something else, who choose to stay, who choose to help, who choose to care. The plague would pass, the empire would fade, time would move forward, as it always does. But somewhere in that silence, in that forgotten moment, a boy proved something that history often forgets. That greatness is not always found in power. Sometimes it is found in the simple refusal to turn away. Thanks for watching the video. Please hit like and subscribe.